Okay, so today's article is from the Indian Express. The objective, see, like I tell you every time, there should be an end objective of our lecture. Today's objective is not to take information, just like every day, we have to learn some skill out of this newspaper session. The skill today, we are using one concept to learn the skill of constructing an argument, especially this is all the more useful in the case of an essay. This article is written by Yogendra Yadav, and the very premise of his article is that the present discourse of the concept of nationalism and how it is antithetical to the idea of democracy, meaning how the present way of projecting nationalism is antithetical to is against the values that our country has. And he argues that this is against the spirit of the constitutional values. Let's try to understand his entire issue, but we are not going to stop at that. In an essay, we should convey our point with a lot of clarity, conviction, and logic. Let us not just agree with whatever the writer is saying or just summarize whatever the writer is saying. We should learn the key skill of constructing an argument using the same logic and countering it to fill some gaps and convey your point. The other day, when we were talking about dissent, there was one more article by a writer called Pratap Banu Mehta, who was talking about how the case of Ashoka University professor, who was criticizing the armed forces for using uh, Sophia Qureshi, who was giving the briefing of Operation Sindhu, and he painted that whole initiative from the Indian government as a communal or intentionally painting a communal angle, where the reality of how secularism is being carried out in our country, the principle that is carried out in our country is not exactly in that light. So that is his criticism. You remember, right? The same article we discussed. Now, the same point is again used by another writer and is projected as something that is anti-constitutional or antithetical to the values of a constitution. Here, the writer is trying to bring the concept of nationalism, and he is trying to explain it through the concept of shared values as a result of our shared values as a result of our Indian freedom struggle. Okay, this is the premise of the article. Now let's go back to our basics. We have been talking from day one about a social contract between individuals and the state. So, what is the role of nationalism in this whole debate? We have to understand that first. So, we will explore the concept of nationalism. What are the different kinds of nationalism? What is the writer saying? What should be the logical argument? How should we logically counter it? So, there are some elements that I am picking from another set of thinkers, but we will be using one major thinker, Tagore. Tagore spoke a lot about nationalism. What is his view? How can we incorporate that? And how can we bring an element of practicality or pragmatism in our today's world? So this is the whole premise of our discussion on nationalism, how to use it in our essay paper and ethics paper. As such, this whole set of arguments need not be directly useful in your, um, how do I put it? It's not useful exactly in your GS 1 2, but it is very useful in your essay and ethics papers, and also to understand the concept of the nation as a whole. Okay, I keep on repeating the same thing time and again about this famous dialogue from Rang De Basanti where I say, कोई भी देश perfect नहीं होता है, उसे perfect बनाना पड़ता है. Meaning, no nation is perfect. We have to strive to make it better and better every day. And what is the definition of this better? That constructive argument is the idea of nation building. It is in this context, let us understand the whole logic and skill of how to argue and construct an essay statement in such a way that you can convince no matter what. So you might be wondering, how can we counter a very scholarly article and academic writer? I'm not asking you to sit in debate with him on the subject matter, but if you take the recourse of logic and learn the methodology of argumentation, you will be able to counter anyone. If you take the recourse of logic, but not, don't take sides, take the recourse of logic. You will be able to defend yourself at any given situation. This is the skill that I want you to have. Okay? Now, moving forward. So, what is the central purpose of this article? We are looking at the tension between constitutional nationalism and imitative nationalism. Meaning, are we trying to mimic some Western idea of what nationalism means, or do we have an original flavor on what nationalism should be like in our country? Now, the other day when someone was asking me what is the difference between nationalism and patriotism, in this class or some other class, I don't remember, the difference between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is a sense of respect and reverence towards our own country in our own way. But nationalism means a feeling of superiority. See, this is the extreme form of nationalism. Like, say, Hitler's Germany, where you feel that this extreme form of nationalism is what every modern political thinker despises or hates and says that we should not go towards that. That extreme form of nationalism, there is another term for it, it's called jingoism. Okay, I've told you, jingoism. Okay, this extreme form of nationalism is what we should move away from. So if we are trying to imitate the Western way of building a nation, or the idea of a nation state premised on this jingoistic principles, then it is dangerous. There are many thinkers in the past, political thinkers, who advocated against it. We have had our own thinkers like Tagore who advocated against it. There is a reason for that. And how should we frame our nationalistic sentiment? We should understand that. But before getting into that debate, let's go back to basics. What is a state? What is the meaning of state? Almost every day we are discussing. I need a participation from you. Population, territory, sovereignty, government. What is the most essential feature of a state? Sovereignty. Nationalism is a means of protecting sovereignty. Can we agree on this? The idea of a philosophy which tries to keep people together as an emotional glue to protect our sovereignty and therefore the state, and therefore as an extended logic, the social contract between an individual and the state. Clear? Nationalism is that philosophy or that emotional glue. That emotional glue should not be weakened. But at the same time, we are not saying that slightest criticism will weaken that emotional glue. There should be, see, there should be some very strong reason that emotional glue will be broken. Right? Not with a slight criticism that whole nation and the idea of nation will get dismantled. But what is the threshold? What is the weak point at which that sovereignty can also be broken? We need to question that situation, that timing. Right? Now, we will understand the concept of nationalism in this sense. So, what is nationalism? We are talking continuously about nationalism, right? Let's understand the meaning of the word nationalism. Firstly, it is a constructed identity. Is it something that is naturally popping up? No. Just like how we look at a person with two legs, two hands, and then we intuitively understand that this is a human being, there is no such thing as a unified definition of what nationalism means. It should be constructed through a dialogue and our shared history. The definition of nationalism is different for different countries. Please understand that. It's a shared identity in the case of India, but it is constructed. It's a constructed identity. First point. Second thing is, you will have to have some common elements between the set of people who want to adopt that identity. The population of that territory, in the definition of state, population, territory, sovereignty and government. Sovereignty and government will let us put it aside. But territory and population should have a constructed identity based on some common elements. Okay? Clear? Am I clear here? Any confusion? Nationalism is a constructed identity. We have to build it carefully. And the purpose of that is unity. Okay? Why? Because in a world where there are limited resources, for that territory, if we have to have sovereignty and the population should support that sovereign power, we need to have a sense of belonging there. We need to respect it. That respect comes from a shared identity for that population through some common elements. Yeah. Right. Right. That's exactly the point of this entire article which we'll be looking at. So, this is not static. Okay. This is the basic principle of what nationalism can be. That shared identity can be territory, language, ethnicity, culture, and purpose. So, India's case is this purpose. India's case is dependent on this purpose. For example, language and ethnicity. Ethnicity can be the basis for German nationalism during the World War. Language can be for someone. Ethnicity, language, territory, and culture. It can be anything. If you take a look at world history, when you have your world history classes, you will understand the concept of balkanization. Balkanization means during the 20th century, late 19th century and 20th century, a lot of European nations, they broke down on the basis of this culture. The balkanization of Europe has led to conflict in Europe, which culminated into the First World War, and that saga continued till modern times. As recent as Nagorno-Karabakh issue between Azerbaijan and Armenia and Azerbaijan. Okay. So this whole concept of balkanization was based on ethnicity, and balkanization means that countries broke down into smaller fragments. If that happens in India, the whole concept of the idea of India will break down. Like he rightly questioned, language is not something that we can depend on. What should we depend on? Ethnicity is not something we can depend on. In a country like diversity, we need to have a purpose to share that identity. That purpose will define why India should stick together as a nation. And if something is done to disturb that identity, is it reasonable or not? Is the whole premise of this article. Okay? And using the same logic and the examples therein, we can create a counter argument and still justify that it is possible. That is the whole purpose and agenda of this class, to learn how to do that. Now we understood what is the meaning of nationalism. It is a constructed identity where there is a common element and it is never static. It will keep on evolving. There needs to be a dialogue. Since it is not static, because the society is not static, there needs to be a continuous mechanism for dialogue. If you are not allowing that dialogue, the idea of a nation will get eroded, and therefore the nationalism that we stand for will get eroded. This is the premise of the article. Clear? Moving on. The two forms of nationalism broadly. When you take a look at the political theory, you will see that there are two forms of nationalism. One is the ethnic or cultural nationalism, and there is a constitutional nationalism that we stand for. See, this is not desirable, this is desirable in India's case. Because you don't have sameness of religion. India and Pakistan are not same. Because the genesis of Pakistan is based on religion. India is a multicultural nation with many religions, many languages. Everything is diverse. So, either language, race or religion, this cannot be the point of discussion in our nationalistic discourse. So, we are completely rejecting this. Okay. So, the nationalism in Indian context, there is no element of debate also, is about constitutional nationalism, which is based on shared values. You got your answer, I suppose? India's constitution is the basis of our shared problems, and our history gives us a lesson as to why we have to stick together. Because even though we are a diverse nation, there is a necessity for us to stick together, and that glue is brought forth by the laws, the institutions and the principles that we have acquired from our freedom struggle. Which we are rejecting. Territory is a concept of state. But not in India's case. Practical history. That is what is stopping us. So his question is, what is stopping us from building a nationalistic identity based on territory? The answer is practical history. it would, there is if you take a look at history, you wouldn't want to feel a constant sense of threat. The whole purpose of India existing as an entity is to have a peaceful coexistence. Today, if you take a look at it, the very purpose of this constitution, do you think if right to freedom of movement is removed from Indian constitution, do you think at this point of time the South Indian states can afford to live on their own? Not really, because the workforce and the cheap labor from the north is what is feeding into the industry of south, because that's the whole market. We are talking about a globalized world, and moving in the direction of smaller territories is just counterintuitive for the prosperity of this nation, especially in the context where we don't have enough resources to cater to this growing population. And you wouldn't want, even let's say you're considering a possibility of southern states, because you might be wondering, okay, to those who don't have a context, there is a debate questioning the very identity of India by some extreme elements in the pockets of our different areas in our country, especially in the south, that language cannot be imposed. We have our own identity, we have our own culture, we have a seaport, we have agriculture, industries, whatever we want, we have all of that. But they tend to forget that industry and everything is built on um, a shared cultural history. Like British came and invested and they built Chennai, for example. Chennai was just a collection of villages, but they got that advantage, a head start. But that head start is now maintained by a labor surplus from the northern states. Take the case of any part of this country, you remove this workforce, the service industry will be crippled. You will not have people who are willing to work as agricultural labor or professionals in, let's say, for example, the hotel industry. It's the people from the north who do not have better employment opportunities. See, if the demography changes and if everything is perfect, then the whole idea of the nation, like I said, it's not static, it's a dynamic dialogue. Then the idea of a nation at that point of time will take a new direction. So that's the whole point of nationalism as a debate. But it should be driven by principle. It is not static, it is dynamic. And what allows that dynamic nature is the principle. Clear? What kind of principles? The constitutional principles of fundamental rights given. Right to freedom of speech, right to life, all the fundamental rights. That creates a space for a dialogue, and that is because of our shared history through freedom struggle. So if you take a look at the freedom struggle, you have luminaries like Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar and Tagore who spoke about the importance or who contributed to the whole idea of what a nation should be. For example, you take the principles from Gandhi, non-violence and inclusive vision that he brought to the nationalistic discourse is still maintained today, because this is what will keep the society peaceful. That narrative and continuous reminder of these principles are very much necessary to build the nationalist identity. Clear? So what can we take from Nehru? See, I'm picking up examples from history to construct an argument and support it through logic. That's all. Okay? It doesn't mean that only these people should be written. Just I'm giving an example. And when Nehru is taken as an example, you will have democratic institutions and the idea of secularism that he stood for. And when you talk about Ambedkar, you will know the constitutional values and the principle of social justice right from Pune Pact till his death in 1950. His whole concept, see, we discussed the concept of social justice, right? We discussed the concept of justice, we discussed the concept of social justice in our previous classes, in our previous editorials. Social justice means correcting the historical injustice, meaning the differences that were created in our society. For example, caste system, it created a natural barrier for growth. Constitution fixed that through affirmative action like reservation through Article 15, Article 16. It removed untouchability, Article 17, and it had the golden triangle 14, 19 and 21 to protect the people and empower them. This legal luminary, Ambedkar, he was responsible for this whole new legal flavor to the identity of a nation. So different people contributed because of the shared values we had to the concept of this nation, and we have to stick to that shared values. It is not based on a narrow concept of ethnicity, territory, or any cultural element, because there is so much diversity. So, constitutional nationalism means it is pluralist. The fact that I gave 3-4 examples, okay, I spoke about Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, and their different viewpoints are incorporated within the constitution itself. That's why it is pluralist. It is inclusive because, like Ambedkar envisioned, all the sections of the society are made a part of our nation building, and it is value driven, because if you take a look at the preamble, you will look at what values we should stand for: unity and integrity of the nation. These are the principles rather than an identity. I hope you got your answer. The preamble itself gives us a direction as to what our nationalist discourse should be like. But now, we'll come to the criticism. Now we'll come to the criticism that is given in the article. So the writer feels that after the constitution came into the picture, we're slowly moving towards the very identity based nationalism which we didn't want to have. So for example, the writer feels that we were blindly copying Western idea of a nation, where their nation building was not on the basis of a shared value but identity. So we should move away from that Western mimicry. That is the first criticism of the writer. Second is that it is driven by insecurity, because the narrative should build confidence in the values that we stand for, but the writer feels that this whole religious debates and everything will weaken or create insecurity among the masses. So we should stop moving away from that. We are reacting from fear rather than confidence on our values. See, if you're really strong about your feeling towards your constitution, you wouldn't be so insecure, is what the article writer says. And any criticism is creating fear among the masses, and that should not be the case. That's why that is the second point. And third point is unity is about respecting diversity in our country. But the writer is criticizing the present government's rhetoric of creating a uniformity as unity. If you are against that idea of uniformity, and anything that is slightly against this principle of uniformity, which is not the premise of our nation building, the article writer says it is creating a sense of insecurity. That is the third point. Fourth point is we are forced to prove our, uh, you know, because we are forced, so because the society is getting so fragmented on this identity based nationalism, the minorities are sometimes forced to prove themselves that they actually subscribe to this identity of a nation, that is India. That is the fourth point in his criticism. Okay. Which one? See, take a example of the article writer from his viewpoint. If let's say there is anything in case of Operation Sindoor, for example, its Pahalgam attack is a clear case of hatred, because the terrorists picked up Hindus and shot them down. It's a hatred driven act of terror which is done by Islamic jihadists. Now, in the post, after that event, in the context of Operation Sindoor, even if someone questions the government on the lines of is this necessary or not, is the escalation necessary or not, if the government is criticized, according to the writer, he feels that if that person's identity matters, if that person is, let's say, a Muslim, that should not be a factor in judging that person's uh, loyalty towards the nation, right? So the writer believes that when you pick up that identity, that the Professor Mahmoodabad, in the case of Ashoka University, he was criticizing. I'll just take the writer's perspective and explain. Just because that writer is a Muslim, there is a banter on Twitter or X that this person is probably supporting Pakistan, and everybody is not happy with that. Okay, so the writer says that because he is a Muslim and because there is an element of fear and because there are women organizations in Haryana who took offense to the way he constructed an argument and said that this is very patriarchal. How can you reduce a woman to a mere instrument of identity politics, especially when she is so celebrated in the way that her career took off. She worked through that career, and she has reached the stage. Instead of respecting that, how can you reduce her to a mere rhetoric in your political discourse? That's what the women's group said, and that's the PIL, in which the Supreme Court said that we have to maintain, that person has to maintain, that person was granted a bail on the condition that he will not make any statement in the near future on that issue. So there was another article by a writer called Pratap Banu Mehta, who also criticized Supreme Court's this gag order and said that this is not in tune with the constitutional values of freedom of speech. In that, we discussed about the problem with that construction of that argument, because the very freedom of speech will have reasonable restrictions under Article 19 Clause 2. Okay, but that restriction should be based on doctrine of reasonableness. what is reasonable can be debated, but saying that it is okay to criticize anyone and any time and get away with it without facing the consequences is a problematic statement. That's what we have discussed. So I'm using the same example here. The writer fears that we are creating a fear psychosis by curbing dissent. So these are the ways in which he constructed his argument. I'm not giving you information. We are trying to understand the mindset of a writer and the basis on which he is writing the article and how to counter it logically. So he explained how we are preferring uniformity over unity. India is a nation that stands united based on diversity. That's why we have the slogans like unity in diversity. Okay? So the shared values are what keeps India together. That is now under tension according to this writer, because he gives instances where uniformity is projected as unity. So he will talk about the demand for sameness, cultural and religious conformity. This is his opinion. Okay. In a political discourse, if one group, see, what is the principle of secularism in Indian context? Sarva dharma samabhava. And I told you that democracy is not about the roar of majority, but also having a room for whisper of a minority. Now, the writer says that we are demanding sameness. But is it a fact that this country is not allowing that demand for sameness to creep into every walk of life? Is there an attempt to carry out any ethnic cleansing like that? No. So, if you want to say that we are creating a demand for sameness, it is a criticism. It need not be a fact. So, the writer believes that it will weaken social fabric because genuine connections across differences are not happening. And there is a suppression of differences because there is a marginalization of minority perspectives, and there is an enforced compliance because there is a utilization of a social and legal pressure to accept. Social means through different means, media, social media, narratives, etc., are constructed to stop any counter narrative to this idea of nationalism. This is what the article writer says. And he also says that the present government is painting dissent as a betrayal to the nation. Okay? And he gives instances. So, how can you support that argument? See, if he has to make a assertion, there should be a reason, right? Assertion, reason. He says that we are trying to criminalize free speech. He's saying that the idea of patriotism is narrowed because we are using the whole idea of nationalism to silence public. And then there is a historical disconnect between the role of dissent in our freedom struggle and the present times. Even during the freedom struggle, even during the constitutional debates, while we are making the constitution, there were a lot of debates. So debate played a very important role in shaping the identity of this nation. We are forgetting that. So this is his premise. All of these arguments are fine. He also gives the case studies within his article. Ali Khan, Mahmudabad. We discussed this article. I'm not going to elaborate it. And then there is this Operation Sindoor commentary where this person critiqued state strategy. And his commentary was painted as seditious by some elements. It is not an official response. Please note that these debates and discourses are between set of peoples and opinions. The only thing that we have to consider is what is institutionally guaranteed. Supreme Court, the legal fact is that Supreme Court gave a bail on a conditional basis. That is the only fact. Rest all are opinions. We don't have actually concrete data except for anecdotal evidences. For every case, we can counter with another incident where this is not the case. I'll take the same case of Ali Khan Mahmudabad. Okay. Here, this article is about nationalism, so I wanted to teach you about what Tagore said. This is not a part of the article, I'm just introducing this here. Tagore was not a very big fan of nationalism, but to take that argument, you need to understand the context in which this argument was made. This is 1917, the time of World War. The world has witnessed one of the worst wars of human history. There was so much loss, and the whole point there was people started fighting on identity basis. Tagore's nationalism is set in that time period, and the statement he made is premised in that period where people were creating nations on the basis of an identity. So he said that nationalism is a great menace. It is the particular thing which for years has been at the bottom of India's troubles. Meaning, India did not have nationalistic identity just like how European nations were having. We should not create an identity based nation because it will lead to conflict. If you encourage that thought, in the future there will be a smaller group within that larger group which will want another nation, and it is not sustainable to create so many nations. So that is what Tagore said. So from his observation, if you want to take some key insights for your argument, it is the concept of spiritual humanism. If you take a look at humanism as a philosophy, it means that you are considering human beings as divine. In short, you are only focusing on the element of humanity as the ultimate form of worship. There is a common element of human identity in the citizens across the world. We have to strive to create that. Remember, this was a concept in 1917 when people were fighting on the basis of an identity. Right? So, true unity through ethical connection. Ethical connection. This is what spiritual humanism talks about, and this argument can be used in your ethics paper, not just essay. So, he wanted to have a living civilization as a nation, meaning there should be a continuous dialogue. We should not encourage a static identity like you having an identity of a race, religion, language as the basis for your national building. That is the shared value that we will take even for today's world. And individual dignity. We spoke about transformative constitutionalism. You remember? What is the meaning of that transformative constitutionalism? Constitutionalism means imposing a limitation on your power, the government power. So, transformative constitutionalism is that identity where you are using constitution as a means to transform the status of dignity of an individual. See, if in the society there is a natural hierarchy, for example caste, if something is happening which is against the dignity of caste, the role of judiciary through the principle of constitutionalism is to uphold this individual dignity. Correct? And we do that through a dialogue, through some laws, some shared values, principles, which will help us construct that Please sit down. Which will help us construct that individual dignity. So, Tagore wanted to have a nation of humanity which is deeply ethical, open to the world, and confident in diversity. So, it is relevant for India in present times. Okay. So, when you're talking about open to the world, where we are engaging with humanity, what does it mean? It's about dialogue. And today we have a dream of becoming Vishwaguru, or we Vasudhaiva Kutumbam. We want to become a Vishwaguru and encourage a global village or a diversity respecting nation, and therefore become a nation that nurtures the idea of a Vasudhaiva Kutumbam. So this is concept that we can take from Tagore, which is already something that we are believing in. But the same point, in contrast to what Tagore said, the writer believes that we are favoring religion-based, identity-based rhetoric. We are trying to suppress speech. We're trying to create some external templates. We're copying, let's say, let us make America great again campaign of Trump, or how Israel believes in superiority of their culture, etc. All these are opinions which are written by the writer. Clear? Now, if you want to take a look at a summary of whatever he is saying, let's take a look at this. The principle, nation as a social contract. According to the writer, what is going now? Rights which are supposed to be unconditional are now becoming conditional on the basis of your political loyalty. He gives some examples. This is what the article writer says. But is it universal? No. But just because it is not universal, it should not become a basis for condemning this viewpoint. Even if one person faces injustice, it is injustice. So, you should not take utilitarian principle, meaning majority of the people are facing good things, so it is okay if the minority are not having those good things and they're facing bad things. That is utilitarian principle. We should not encourage that thought with respect to justice. Okay? Because that one person can sometimes create an army of people who will hate another country and therefore as an extension another nation. They want to create separate nations sometimes. That's why you should not encourage that. See, we are showing that principle wherever we are showing dissent. Dissent is actually patriotism, because you want to make things better. You are not okay with the values that we stand for. That is why you are criticizing someone. But that is being framed as betrayal in some instances. And diversity is a strength that is now transforming into the rhetoric is transforming that into a weakness, according to the writer. And then, national interest doesn't mean ruling party interest. And that is changing according to the writer, because dissenters are being painted as anti-national. Okay, these are the set of arguments. We are not taking any points on this political opinion, but we are learning how to construct an argument. He constructed an argument. So first you will learn the skill of constructing an argument by reading that article after this class is over. He has a central point. He has the diversity of points and each example to construct his argument. The purpose of reading this article is to learn how to construct an argument for your essay. Okay? And second benefit is knowing about this identity of a nation, the concept of nationalism, viewpoints, etc. Don't forget the first use, learning the skill of constructing an argument. Now if we have to logically counter, you are sitting in front of the writer and you want to logically counter using the same principles. How will you do it? See, this is just a summary. We'll come back to this ethical angle, but let's take a look at this argument. How will you counter it? Tell me. Take the case of example of same Ali Khan Mahmudabad. Is it okay to make that statement in such a sensitive time? See, you have freedom of speech, but there is also the doctrine of reasonableness which the judiciary uses. In a social contract between individual and the state, that, okay, don't you think state, you're demanding rights from the state, what are you giving back? You need to have a fundamental duty which is not justiciable. Just because nobody can ask you to perform your duty mandatorily doesn't mean you can get away by saying anything and everything at a very inappropriate time, which will disturb the very emotional glue, which will disturb the very shared value. See, the whole point of this article is that nation building should be based on shared values. One of that value is feeling an identity of brotherliness, or there should be integrity within the nation. In such a sensitive time, when there is a fact, the fact is that this was an act, Pahalgam was an act of terror based on identity. And we are not trying to homogenize the entire community. All we did was, Operation Sindoor was only meant for what? Dismantling the terror camps. We did not attack any civilian there. We did not question the identity of anyone in our country or in. It was this person who attacked that identity. Just because we are a secular nation with the freedom of speech doesn't mean an individual can incite hatred towards one community. Suppose if some more people start painting that communal picture in such a sensitive time, don't you think it is difficult for the government to maintain internal security, because communal tensions can flare up? So it is very much justified to ask the person to not speak anything, and on that condition bail is given on the basis of national security lens. So we are still sticking to the same constitutional values, and one of the value is doctrine of reasonableness, Article 19 Clause 2, where we say that, look boss, you have all the rights to speak, but this is not an appropriate time. You are disturbing the emotional glue that keeps this nation together. Timing of your dissent is extremely important, because the timing can disturb the national security. What if it brings down the morale? When your own people are going against you, do you think the army will feel confident enough? Sometimes maybe not. This is the principle through which you can argue. See, I'm only talking about this specific case. If the writer is using this specific case, we have to use the same case to counter. His arguments might be valid in some other situations. Always look at the facts of the case. But somehow, using this example didn't feel appropriate for me because of the same reason. So, how should we frame our thought process on nationalism? It should be based on a robust dissent based on logic and responsible speech. an individual and the state are in a social contract, the right should give, I mean, the state should give rights which cannot be conditional, and nation should be getting some duties from its citizen, which keeps this dialogue dynamic. Otherwise, it becomes a mechanical, static, one-way traffic. The identity of a nation is built through fulfilling that social contract. Citizens should do their duty. State should do its duty. That is giving rights. That is not happening, and therefore, that dissent is not coupled with responsible speech. Institutional nationalism means a nationalism where every person, every citizen becomes a stakeholder in democracy, participative democracy. Questioning and demanding accountability is the kind of nationalism we should strive for, because that is the value on which democracy thrives. So, security centric state capacity should not counter citizen liberty. We have to raise the standards on both. Just because someone questioned accountability, the state cannot get insecure, and just because you have the freedom of speech, you cannot say anything and everything at an inappropriate time. There is a time and timing for everything. You should understand. If you don't have the sensibility to understand that, they can probably be warned. This is the way in which I want you to construct an argument. Okay? Now let's go to the ethical angle. Okay? See, the nation has an underlying spirit, the spirit which is the soul of this nation. What is that spirit? There is an ethical core where the moral principles which are given in the preamble, we the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, secular, socialist, democratic republic. All those are values, moral principles. They guide our national identity. Okay? So, when you follow those principles, it's a message to the humanity, to the world around, that we stand by our principles, not just in rhetoric, but through actions also. We are proving ourselves. Our nationalism proves its adherence to these values as a dynamic but not a static concept where the society evolves through all the wings of the government. State has population, territory, sovereignty, government. Government is divided into legislative, executive, and judiciary. Judiciary is dealing with constitutionalism, transformative constitutionalism, and it is upholding the sovereignty and as well as dignity. But what about the other two? This executive and legislative will be accountable only if people participate in that democracy. Participative democracy is important for nation building. Okay? We need to respect this unity in diversity, which is an ethical need, a practical need for India to stick together and live in peace. And freedom of expression is a patriotic duty, because if you see something is wrong, like कोई भी देश perfect नहीं होता है, you need to question it, fix it. Question it with an intent to fix it, not to break it. So his dissent, what was the purpose of that dissent at that particular point of time? What value? His dissent was probably didn't feel like a patriotic duty at that point of time. So that's what it is. Okay, this is how you have to construct an argument. You can ask a question now. Correct. is it right or is it ethical to remain selectively silent when other things are going wrong and raise your voice only when your bias is justified? See, no two sides. In a debate, no two sides will have complete perfection. There will be flaws in either sides. The purpose of a dialogue is to not win, it is to give better values to the society. But what is happening? The debate is not based on how to get better. It is to win an argument, it is to win an election and further an agenda. That becomes dangerous. Okay? So that is what we have to stop. Clear? Personality cult. That's why I keep telling you. Individuals are not important, institutions are, and our values should be premised on institutional integrity, not individuals. Institutions are designed for the worst case scenario. His question is, it is normal that the majority will dominate the minority. So, what is wrong in that? It's natural that it happens. So, how do we fix it? That's the question. Institutions are designed, there are checks and balances in our constitution. We have rights for the same purposes. There are barriers placed within the constitution. We have checks and balances between the three wings of the government for the same reason, and accountability is demanded. There is a provision for that accountability, but if you don't use it, it will become the whims and fancies of majority. Whose mistake is it? What is and what ought to be are different. Okay. So, in simple ways, what is on paper and what is on ground reality, there is a difference. And don't you think, what is the question? If that is the case, then the majoritarian demand should have actually happened by now. Why isn't it happening? You got your point. Institutions are the safeguards. The very existence of institutions will stop that from happening. And if that is not there, you would, like you mentioned, that majoritarian view would have already happened. But it's not happening. So, dissent is important to ensure that even the slightest erosion of that institutional values should be immediately flagged and questioned. Because you give leeway to one incident, and if we have that chalta hai attitude, it's okay, it will work, no problem. If you have that kind of an attitude, it will be the beginning point of deterioration of the idea of a nation state built on shared values. That is the big problem. A participative democracy should be driven by the wisdom of the people, not dictated by a personality cult. We don't need a nation which has only followers. We need a nation which has participants. So, the whole idea of constitutionalism is premised on shared participation, shared values and participation. And it is important to have national security lens in this hyper weaponized world. When I say weaponized, when you can frame dissent and use it as a weapon, when you have internal security threats where narratives are built to weaken that emotional glue, of course, the institution should, raise their bar and question even the intent of that dissent. So dissent cannot be weaponized against the sovereignty of this country. It's a non-negotiable. The very idea of sovereignty is that nothing should disturb my decision-making power. Just because there is a global NGO which is funding some activity in our country doesn't mean you get to influence and disturb the very idea of a nation. Dissent cannot be weaponized and it should be curbed at any cost. It's like a weed that will pollute the fertile soil of diversity in our country, so it needs to be curbed. So, nationalism should be muscular whenever it's needed, but it should always be constitutional. And this can be the conclusion of your argument. Okay? That's it for today. I hope you learned the skill that we were discussing about. This writer has beautifully constructed his thesis, gave supporting arguments, and concluded. You can also counter him on certain premises. We have seen how to do that. Now go back and read that article and learn that skill every time you construct an argument. And that is the most important skill that you need to pick up for your essay. Okay? That's it for today. See you tomorrow.